Hello. This session on this sequence of little 10-minute boosters for GCSE students is relating to the structure of the play An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley. It's a play that is probably about the most commonly taught text across the country. It's a play in which you will find an enormous amount of resources online and available through a variety of interfaces to engage with. But I wanted to talk today in my 10-minute slot about structure and really not a lot else. So we're going to look at a number of things. We're going to look at the way the play as a whole is structured. We're going to look at perhaps the structure that works running from act to act. And we're going to look also, therefore, at what Priestley is doing, structuring the play in this way. And we'll bring that in, as I say, in around 10 minutes. So the play as a whole is clearly structured with what we might see as a frame that surrounds, if you like, the business of the play. If we could argue that it's only once the inspector comes into the play, halfway through Act 1, that we start to tackle the actual moral crisis of the play. And it's only after he leaves in Act 3, and we're left with the family again, left on their own, that we see how this works out and whether or not things have changed in the duration of time that we've been sitting in the theatre. So we have a structure where at either end of the play, we are meeting the family. Consequently, we're able to compare them and we'll see what has happened. And what's quite clear is that the family we meet at the beginning, this aspirant suburban upper middle class family of arrogant, self-obsessed fools, is different to a degree when we get to the end. And Priestley's idea of showing us how society can be changed for the better, away from the capitalist, Darwinian, every man for himself attitude of Mr. Burling, or the arrogant attitude of his wife, the entitlement that comes from being wealthy and part of a super rich in that time, can be replaced by a society in which social responsibility and awareness of the need to support the weak in society can be seen. What Priestley is able to do by the end is to draw the battle lines clearly. On the one side, the older generation, and they're joined by Gerald, who, as we know from our opening stage directions, is older than Sheila. He is in his 30s. We get Gerald siding with the older generation, and we get the younger generation in terms of Eric and Sheila, who seem to have been converted by the events of the play into a more socially responsible socialist outlook and way of life. This is not to, particularly in the case of Eric, this is not to remove from him the taint of the way that he has specifically treated Eva, which may include rape, certainly includes to some form of sexual congress, only very slightly shy of what we in the 21st century would see as rape. There is little that we can find in Eric that is positive. But of course, I would argue, and I have argued on my blog if people want to look at that, that Priestley isn't writing this play for any reason really other than the political point that he is trying to make throughout it, that there is a better socially responsible way for people to live their lives and to behave. That is what interests him, not the issue of whether or not Eric may or may not have transgressed in this extreme way. And so the framing of the play, the beginning, there is, if not harmony, there is a relative unanimity of purpose in the family, and at the end they are split. It's worth noticing at the beginning that the member of the family who is the only person really that speaks out against the father is Eric, and it seems that it's the youngest who turn first. Sheila then moves on to that side once she meets the inspector. But to a degree, I would argue that Eric has already gone there, and that's evident in the conversations he has with Gerald and his father. probably therefore suggesting that Eva and his experiences with Eva has served to already awaken this social conscience in Eric. So within the frame, if we begin to look at the play, therefore, act by act within the frame, what we get is a sequence of interviews. And each interview adds layer upon layer upon layer of knowledge for the audience, but also for the characters. And we have to remember that this play is what is technically called a well-made play. That is to say, one of the features of any well-made play is that it's a play in which the characters gain knowledge and understanding at the same time as the audience gain knowledge and understanding. It's not to say that there's no room for devices such as dramatic irony, which Priestley uses hugely, especially in the context of Mr. Burling and his speeches about the Titanic and so on, which we all know to be failures. That's used really to define his character. In terms of the play and the action of the play, of what happened to this Eva Smith, who none of us knew existed, Priestley uses a variety of techniques. He uses, firstly, the fact that Gould controls who he is speaking to. He controls, by use of the little conceit with the photograph, that only one person at a time is seeing anything clearly. And of course, we do never know whether or not this is the same photograph being shown to anybody, to everybody rather, because of course it doesn't matter. As Sheila has worked out, if people have done the things they have done, then they have behaved wrongly. But we get this sense of the interviews piling upon each other, and every now and then Priestley brings the changes to help us out. So, for example, Gerald's interview is largely undertaken by Sheila. Priestley finds a reason to get Gould out of the room. We have gradually the sensation of a larger audience. We move towards the end, so that when Eric is being interviewed, the family are present for that shaming revelation of the way that he has behaved. What Priestley does that is rather clever, I think, is that each act follows immediately on the one previously. That seems like a rather silly thing to say, but it's no accident, obviously, that the final word of each act is the first word of the next. The play, as a well-made play, inhabits a world that we call, it embodies the Aristotelian, after the philosopher Aristotle, unity of time and space. In other words, this idea of a drama in which the only time that elapses is the time it takes for the events of the drama to take place. And we don't change venue. We stay in a single room the whole time, so that we end up with a sort of 2.5 to 3 hour single room exposition. No time elapses. We don't get any sense of half an hour later that we have to sort of fill in the gaps of what might have taken place. It is continuous. And we wonder why he does this. And surely the play is structured with these cliffhangers in such a way that the audience, leaving the auditorium, have just had a shock. They go into the bar, they discuss that shock. And we might think why, until we remember that this is not a play about the aristocracy behaving badly. This is a play about a suburban family. Nothing particularly special about that. They're certainly not poor, but they're also not super wealthy. This is a businessman who owns his own business, and they live in what is, we are told at the beginning, is a large suburban house. It's one of the things I have real issue with the BBC version that you may well have watched on video, where the Burlings seem to live in a mansion on a hill with all the trappings of that aristocratic life. The whole point about the Burlings is they don't have that. They are trying to be something they aren't, in a sense. They are being over aspirational, maybe a touch of what Macbeth would no doubt call vaulting ambition about them. And the important thing about that is, particularly in the 1940s when the play was first performed, Mr. Burling could be any man in the audience, Mrs. Burling similarly, Eric, Sheila similarly. The audience will recognise themselves. A large proportion of audiences attending this play will be coming from the very same suburban homes that the Burlings inhabit. And the more realistic the set is, the more Priestley's aim of making us engage on a personal level with these characters becomes clear. And we have to notice that. So we get our time to consider, we get brought back after the interval, straight back into the action, as if it had never finished. And we go through and we go through and we go through. And the order of the revelations ensures that the biggest shock of all, Eva being pregnant, is delivered last. Now, we might have guessed it. Sheila guesses it, whilst Sybil is being interviewed, but we don't know it until the moment that Eric appears in the door. That's the moment that we know that our suspicion is correct, and that is the purpose of that structure. The characters and the audience are being pulled along together to the moment of revelation at the very end, following all the various smaller revelations that have appeared in the play thus far. It's a very, very, very clever way of writing. So we may wonder, in terms of the structure of the play as a whole, why the play doesn't end in some rather more dramatic way, with Gould being able to produce revelation out of nowhere, or the threatened fire and everything else that's going to pour down on us if we don't learn our lessons taking place. And of course, the play has to end on a similar cliffhanger to each of the subsequent acts. If it doesn't, then there's really a bit of a problem in terms of the engagement of the audience. It is vital for Priestley's message to a relatively complacent, relatively capitalist audience that as they leave the theatre, they are faced with a discussion of why on earth does it end with the phone call? What is going to happen? Well, of course, what is going to happen? The same thing will happen as has already happened in a sort of Groundhog Day. Although now there is a difference. Sheila and Eric are already on the same side as the next person who's going to appear to interrogate the conscience of this family. We may begin to assume that Gerald will come over fairly quickly, if only because he's going to be driven by the fact that he wants to marry Sheila. And that leaves the older generation, the ones who possibly won't change, the ones who possibly, the most we can hope is that they become aware to a degree, and even if they don't admit their faults, are able to understand that a fault is there. Whether they take that seriously or not, we can't argue. But the important thing about the structure is that we understand that by ending this play in this totally open-ended, and the first time you see it, very unexpected manner. Don't forget, you'll never repeat the first time you got to the end of the play and thought, what? Priestley ensures that his message continues to question away and to tease away at the minds and the thought processes of a relatively complacent suburban group of people who he needs to change. He needed to bring the suburbs over to the socialist labour movement. The play is written in part as one of the ways that he intended to do that. It is effectively a party political broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party, and it's an extremely well written and very powerful one. You can't read this play without the politics. And if you don't engage with the politics, the play rather loses its purpose, because we discover by the end that actually nothing necessarily has happened, that Eva might not have existed, that even if she did, she may have committed suicide, but that's not a criminal offence by any of the family, and so on. The last point about structure to think about, though, is the organisation of the interviews. Each of the Burlings can be said to have committed one of the cardinal sins. We don't get through all 7 sins, obviously, but whether that's lust, whether that's envy, whether that's greed, whether that's pride, each of the Burlings can be seen to represent these. And that layer of structure in this play is the structure in which Gould representing the sort of good everyman, is able to work in the manner of a medieval mystery play to save the soul of the person or persons under perceived threat from the evil inhabiting the characters representing the sins themselves. Of course, unlike the mystery play, where there is a character on stage to be saved, in this play, the characters who need saving are the audience. The sinners are on stage, presented as such, clearly, one at a time, carefully structured, so that we become increasingly appalled by them. And we leave the theatre, in a sense, cleansed by the whole process. I hope this is useful, and thank you very much for listening.